In 1997, Dallas-based video game developer Ensemble Studios struck gold with the release of their historical real-time strategy game, Age of Empires. The game was succeeded by an even more impressive sequel, Age of Empires II: The Age of Kings, in 1999, and shipped more than 2 million copies within 3 months of its release. But despite its critical and commercial acclaim, it was clear to the team at Ensemble that they wouldn't get away with doing the same thing again. So rather than starting work on Age of Empires 3, the team took a slight detour and created Age of Mythology, a real-time strategy game based not on history, but myths and legends instead. Upon its release in late 2002, the game received high praise from both critics and fans alike, with it boasting a brand new 3D engine, a slew of distinguishing features, and an impressive single-player campaign that was unlike anything players had seen before. In this video, we'll be taking a look back at the development of Age of Mythology, the challenges the team faced when designing the game, as well as the numerous changes the game underwent during development. This is the history of Age of Mythology. While development of Age of Mythology officially started after the release of Age of Empires 2, work on the game was already sufficiently underway by this point in time. Just 2.5 weeks after the release of the first Age of Empires, in 1997, Ensemble began developing the early versions of what would become Age of Mythology, known internally as RTS-3. Unlike its predecessor, Age of Mythology would not be built in the Genie engine, but a brand new proprietary 3D engine called Bang. It's for this reason that development of Age of Mythology needed to start early, as the team's goals differed from that of Age of Empires 2. The problem was, they needed Age of Mythology to look as good as what they were starting to see with Age of Empires 2, but in 3D. To make matters worse, while they had set out to create a 3D engine, they weren't entirely sure they could do it. It took a considerable amount of effort, but they eventually ended up with something that they were all extremely pleased with. The leap to 3D meant the team was able to implement features that would have been impossible to do in their previous games, such as flying and underwater creatures, in-engine cinematics, and deformable terrain. It also made it possible for them to do special effects, like those seen with the god powers. It was a truly liberating experience for the team, as there were so many new things they could do that they simply couldn't in 2D. While the programming team was hard at work coding the engine, the design team started compiling a list of potential concepts. They had time to brainstorm while work was progressing on Age of Empires 2, but that didn't make the decisions any easier. They had a series of very painful meetings, where they'd get into long discussions about what kind of RTS game they wanted to do. Science fiction, World War II, superheroes, cowboys, fantasy, even going back and remaking the original Age of Empires. Practically every idea you could think of was being considered. They took the 5 best ideas they had, and spent about a month or 2 fleshing them out. Their first serious prototype was based on the lost civilization of Atlantis, but they ended up dropping it, along with 3 other working prototypes, finally settling on the concept of mythology. Part of the appeal of doing mythology was all of the new stuff the team could put into the game that they hadn't really dealt with before, such as mythological creatures, heroes, and god powers, each of which would introduce surprising new elements. The topic was also rich in characters and stories that they could pull from, to create a game that felt familiar enough that it wouldn't alienate fans, yet different enough to keep the team interested. With the concept decided, the next step was figuring out which mythologies they should base the game on. Lead designer Ian Fisher led the research effort, and began looking for mythologies that were sufficiently familiar, accessible, and non-controversial. The 3 that best fit those requirements were the Greek, Egyptian, and Norse. None were the basis of an important religion today, yet all 3 were well known, and had a wealth of information about them that they could use for the game. Their primary sources of information came from books like Bulfinch's Mythology and Edith Hamilton's Mythology, as well as large encyclopedias of mythology and children's books, the latter of which were especially useful for their artists, as they usually featured a wealth of images. A typical reference book was Myths and Legends by Neil Phillip, which featured well-illustrated sections that described mythology from all over the world at a basic level. The team already possessed a large library of information on the Greeks and Egyptians, because both were featured in Age of Empires. They used these library sources for architectural concepts and ideas for how to differentiate the 3 major cultures. Designer Greg Street found the Encyclopedia Mythica website to be a great source when looking for minor gods, heroes, and mythological creatures. Other websites provided useful glossaries of military units from ancient armies, as well as the names of these units. From all of these sources, the team gleaned ideas for gods, god powers, heroes, mythological units, and improvements, as well as stories that could be woven into the game's single-player campaign. In many cases, the team decided what they wanted to do first, and then found some justification or source for it in mythology. Although the core structure shared a lot in common with Age of Empires, Age of Mythology originally had quite a few differences. You'd start out as one of the three cultures, Greek, Egyptian or Norse. You'd then have the choice of three deities in the first age. For example, for the Norse, those deities were Loki, Odin and Thor. When you built a temple to one of them, you'd get their technologies or combat bonuses. The sooner you built the temple, the sooner you'd get said bonuses, but your choice was also broadcast to all other players, allowing them to pick other deities that could better exploit your weaknesses. The pacing was different too, as there were advantages to hanging back in each age. In order to advance to the next age, you needed to build at least one temple, but you could build more to increase your mythological power. According to lead designer Ian Fisher, you could build the smallest, cheapest, fastest temples and rush through the ages, but the player who sat back and built all of the temples would have an advantage. While playing Age of Empires 2, they noticed that they tended to build up to the 3rd or 4th age before attacking with an army of fully upgraded units. But with Age of Mythology, they were having meaningful combat in each age. To complement the earlier power curve, games would play out much faster. A typical game in Age of Empires 2 took up to 2 hours, while games in Age of Mythology took over an hour or less. According to designer Greg Street, there were options for players who desired a longer game, but they wanted to skew the default game down. Part of the reasoning for this was to combat situations they'd seen in Age of Empires 2, where the player had basically won, but the computer was fighting tenaciously to the last man. They wanted to make it so you could get to the fun part quicker, and once you'd won, it'd be over. One of the ways they did this was by introducing fertile terrain and territorial control. The idea was that the more fertile terrain you had, the more food you could grow. Similarly, the more territory you controlled, the larger your population, but that also meant you had more territory to defend. If you marched into an enemy town and took it over, you'd also take away their fertile terrain slots, making you stronger and making it more difficult for them to fight back, accelerating the game. A major gameplay change occurred when they went from population control being farms that could only be placed on special terrain, to town centres that could only be built on top of existing settlements. One of the problems with the farm model was that it tied two critical resources, food and population, to a single spot of land. Town centres, on the other hand, were easy to limit because they were powerful defensive buildings that they wanted to keep from being used offensively. Houses also had some initial teething problems. For much of the game's development, they worked differently for each culture, or didn't exist at all. It was only after a lot of playtesting that the team thought it best to put them back, as they didn't want the game to be too different from what Age of Empires fans were used to. A giant turning point came in May 2001, about a year and a half before the game's release. They took some time to flesh out the final feature list, and from this list came a lot of the God Powers myth units. They had some rough ideas from the start, and a lot of unfun things were tried, but they continued to iterate until they had something that worked. Iteration was at the heart of Ensemble's design process. As such, many things would change during development, but that doesn't mean every idea made it in. There were a number of myth units that were scrapped entirely, including the Greek flying land hybrid Griffin, the Egyptian tail-wagging Apep, and the bizarre North reindeer Trollman, Trollcarrion. According to senior designer Bruce Shelley, a number of god powers were also axed, including Bramble, a sort of Venus flytrap, Inferno, an area of fire the team couldn't keep units from walking into, and Enrage, a god power that made units fight better. There were some ideas, on the other hand, that were so good that they barely changed at all. A good example being the Norse mobile drop-off site, the Ox Cart. It was a clever idea from the outset, and never really evolved past the original design. On the 3rd of May 2001, Microsoft announced that it had acquired Ensemble Studios. According to senior designer Bruce Shelley, the acquisition didn't slow the team down in any way. Microsoft was very much committed to clearing obstacles out of their path, to make sure they could get the game done unimpeded. One such obstacle was the time they were having to spend at the managerial level, negotiating contracts and general business affairs. A lot of that went away once Microsoft took over. Additionally, they helped Ensemble grow their team and put some of the testing back into their hands, meaning they could have people doing testing right down the hall from where their programmers were working. As development of Age of Mythology continued, the team faced numerous challenges with some of the game's standout features. God powers being one such example. There was a real concern early on that they'd just end up being nukes. This violated one of Ensemble's core design philosophies, that every strategy must have a counter, so they set out to try and make one. They came up with the idea of having god powers targeted by a hero that would take time to invoke, giving the opponent a chance to kill the hero or escape. It made sense on paper, but didn't work in-game. Being able to stop a god power meant very few were actually seen, and for a feature they were spending so much time on, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. It also made them feel less like natural disasters, and more like spells being cast by a sorcerer. The final nail in the coffin was that it made heroes feel kinda pathetic, since they needed to be weak enough to be killed before they could finish invoking a god power. So the team threw out that idea, and decided that maybe god powers didn't need to be countered. This meant they had to limit them in other ways. Some lobbied for god powers to cost resources, but they quickly realised that wouldn't work either, because a player with a strong economy could just lob meteors at their opponent every few minutes, which meant they'd have to be weaker than their visuals suggested. Conversely, if they made them too expensive, it would once again limit the amount of god powers in play. The solution they finally settled on was making them usable only once. Since the Age of Empires series already had the concept of multiple discrete ages, it made sense to have one god power per age. They could then balance god powers that were less useful on certain maps, by letting players choose between two of them every time they advanced in age. Even though this got them 90% of the way to balancing god powers, there was still plenty of tweaking that needed to be done. Some god powers had a random component to them, like Tornado, which wandered around on its own. This meant that it could destroy anywhere between 1 and 40 buildings, depending on where it went. So they implemented a system where the damage of a god power could be capped. This was a lifesaver for god powers like Curse, that turned villagers and soldiers into pigs. Even when cast on a huge army, you would never be able to convert more than a few hundred hit points. Another god power with massive balance problems was Fimbulwinter, which summoned packs of wolves to attack enemy town centres. In a 1v1 game, you could hit 5 to 6 town centres, but in a 6v6 game, you might be hitting up to 20 or more. They addressed this by limiting the number of wolf packs to just 4, regardless of the number of players in a game. Meanwhile, Shifting Sands, a god power that teleports a group of units across the map, ended up being abused rather quickly. It didn't take long for players to figure out that they could transport enemy villagers into rows of towers, where they'd get shot and die, greatly delaying the opponent's economic advancement. The team solved this problem by having Shifting Sands only transport a few villagers and slightly more soldiers. Then there was Frost, a god power that would freeze enemy units, allowing players to retreat. Except, rarely did people do that, because it was far quicker to just wipe out an army once they had been frozen. Decreasing the duration of the god power only made it less useful, so their solution was to add armor to the frozen units, so they'd be much harder to kill. This worked, but early on, there was a bug that didn't remove the armor once units defrosted, allowing them to take down entire armies on their own. Another standout feature that caused the team some trouble was the single-player campaign. Since Mythology was all about epic events, they wanted to tell a single compelling story that players could get invested in. Part of the difficulty of doing that was trying to justify why Greeks, Egyptians and Norse were running around together, even though the actual cultures were isolated both by geographical space and hundreds of years of time. Things were made more complicated by the fact that, when they initially started work on the script, they didn't even know what the engine was capable of. So when they weren't designing gameplay features, all of the designers sat down to craft the story. They went through numerous edits, dropped entire characters, and ended up with a 130-page script. This would then get whittled down even more once they started to streamline the in-game cinematics. Since Age of Mythology was built on a proprietary 3D engine, they figured they could use the same art assets to show the events occurring in between missions, but seeing the hero as a blocky 6-polygonal blob kind of killed the suspension of disbelief. To address this problem, the artists provided high-poly versions of all the major characters, as well as many other units and objects that could be swapped in when needed. When a scenario ended, they'd pull the camera in and seamlessly transition into the cinematic. Then the next scenario would start by zooming out the camera and seamlessly transition back to the gameplay. Designing the scenarios presented its own set of challenges, namely that random map games were so much fun that it was difficult to justify why a scenario was a better way to spend your time. If every mission started with a town centre and 3 villagers, players would simply go back to random maps, where they'd know the computer has to deal with the same set of circumstances. To tackle this problem, they started with a large pool of potential scenario ideas, and then made sure every one of them offered some type of gameplay that you couldn't see in a random map game. These hooks could be as simple as having to play 2 towns that were geographically isolated, to having to fend off enemy attacks for a certain amount of time, to the truly unique missions that involved units, terrain or god powers that just weren't available anywhere else in the game, such as the Hammer of Thor, or a box containing pieces of the Egyptian god Osiris. Their next obstacle was ensuring players of every skill level could actually make it through the campaign. To that end, an enormous amount of effort was put into balancing the game's difficulty level for every type of player. Lastly, they needed to address a problem they'd seen in their previous campaigns, where players avoided using heroes so that they wouldn't risk failing the mission should they perish. To address this issue, they not only made heroes useful in combat, but made sure they couldn't be permanently killed. When reduced to 0 hit points, they'd simply stay down until the player retook control of the area. The heroes would then regenerate, and eventually stand back up again to resume the fight. The musical score and sound effects for Age of Mythology were composed by Stephen Rippey and Kevin McMillan. In the past, they'd relied heavily on synthesizers and keyboards, but for Age of Mythology, they were given the opportunity to compose for a full 70-piece orchestra and choir. They also created a dynamic music system which allowed the game to crossfade between 2 mixes of a given song, depending on what the player was doing in the game. For example, if they took a lot of damage and lost a lot of units, the music would downshift to a more ambient somber mix, whereas if they started attacking a significant building or used particular god powers, the music would quickly shift to a totally separate playlist of battle tracks. Their instrument pool grew a great deal during the development of the game, and they tried to incorporate as many of them as they could. Some of the more unique additions were an Egyptian oud, a pair of wind wands, a noisemaker that uses rubber bands, and a conch shell horn. When it came to the game's sound effects, the team made the decision to create the majority of them from scratch, rather than using their existing libraries. They recorded sounds from practically everywhere, whether that meant getting people out of the office to go and stomp around in the parking lot, or going to the grocery store and finding vegetables to smash, or taking their sound equipment to the local zoo to record the animals there. Some of the sounds they recorded ended up being used in the weirdest places, like a room of penguins that turned into the sound of souls being tortured in the underworld. One of Ensemble's most basic design philosophies was to make games by playing them. To facilitate this, not only did they have standard quality assurance testing, but they also assigned each person 1 day per week to play the game for a couple of hours and give feedback. They wanted Age of Mythology to be accessible to everyone, so they put the game in front of people with different skill levels to ensure it'd be fun for all types of players and playstyles. They then looked for problems they had, made changes, and tested the game again, continuously iterating until they had something they thought everyone could enjoy. These playtests also served another more obvious purpose, to find bugs and game imbalances. They noticed that staff tended to find more bugs when they were playing the game than they did while sitting at their desks. If an artist saw a missing texture, they'd see firsthand how it negatively impacted the game, and would often run right out to get it fixed. Designers were also more likely to listen to complaints coming from their peers than they would some faceless tester in another building. As if this rigorous amount of testing wasn't enough, Ensemble also brought in expert players for a comprehensive beta test, as well as an online beta test that featured over 10,000 users. Sometimes fans that hadn't even played the game could spot a problem just from hearing about it on forums or magazine previews. From all of this extensive playtesting came copious amounts of feedback that helped shape the final game. For example, early on, they had a lot of trouble with experienced players walling in each other's resources and buildings. They realised that if this was happening already, it would be out of control by the time the game hit store shelves. So they implemented a fix that prevented walls from being built too close to gold mines or enemy town centres. It solved the walling problem, but was confusing to some of the less experienced players who wanted to understand the logic behind the decision. Some feedback was easy to discard, like having gods come down and walk around the map to destroy things. It sounded cool, but it would have been a logistical nightmare for questionable gain. Some changes were made in order to make things less irritating for players. A good example was the role of the Egyptian priest. Originally, they converted enemy myth units instead of killing them like other heroes. The binary nature of this relationship meant they'd either steal your unit or die trying. Not only was this not fun, it was also frustrating for both attacker and defender. Later, they also had to prevent priests from picking up relics, since the Egyptians started the game with one. While many of these changes helped balance the game, it was also possible to overdo it too. If every unit was the same, they'd technically be balanced, but the game would also be boring. Towards the end of the game's development, there were concerns from those within the company that they were tanking too many of the civilization bonuses and god powers in order to keep them from being too powerful. They all agreed that in the long run, It was better to have a really fun game rather than a really well-balanced game, so they ended up boosting many of the numbers that had trickled down over time. By late 2001, it became apparent that Ensemble wouldn't be able to ship the game in time for their scheduled spring 2002 release window, and so it was subsequently delayed until later that year. One of the reasons why the team couldn't finish the game on time was their ambitious single-player campaign. There were a lot of things that needed to be finished before they could really get into the meat of it, such as the AI. Without these critical components, it was difficult to nail down completed scenarios and be sure about them. Elsewhere, the marketing department was having problems of their own. Artist David Sherry was responsible for Age of Mythology's box art. As a traditional artist, he preferred to paint with acrylics where possible, but when working on a box cover for a game, there were so many changes and so many deadlines one on top of another that it was simply more practical to scan the art into a computer and work in Photoshop to make any changes. The problem was that everything had to be set up to be a certain size, so when the marketing department was informed that the size of the box was going to be changed, panic set in. It wasn't unusual for industry standards for PC game box sizes to change, as it had happened several times before, but suddenly being told this, when they were late in the production process, was far from ideal. Everything had to be made smaller, so things didn't fit. It was stressful for a while, but they managed to get it done in time. Following the game's successful launch in late 2002, work soon began on an expansion pack called Age of Mythology: The Titans. It was decided early on that they were going to include a new culture, and after discussing the topic for several weeks, they settled on the Atlanteans, as it gave them a ton of material from which they could borrow for new units, god powers and mythological creatures, whilst also providing a great source for a new single-player campaign. Atlantis was also fairly well known to people through extensive literature as well as a recent Disney movie. In addition, many people wanted to know what happened after the original campaign story ended, and the team thought it'd be an interesting topic to build an expansion upon. The idea of the Titan came from lead designer Ian Fisher. In essence, a Titan was like a wonder that might win the game for you, but not thanks to a passive timer countdown as seen in their previous games. Instead, a Titan was an enormously powerful unit that you could use, a wonder that could fight. They began prototyping the idea, and once they played with it, they loved it. Once Titans were in the game, they never played a multiplayer match without at least one Titan making an appearance. Then there was the Atlantean culture itself. Unlike the other cultures, Atlanteans were given multiple uses of their god powers, with First Age god powers having 4 uses, Second Age god powers having 3 uses, Third Age god powers having 2 uses, and Final Age god powers only having a single use. They weren't as dramatic or powerful as ones seen in other cultures, but the trade-off was that you'd get to use them multiple times. Atlanteans were also given the ability to convert normal human units into heroes. The other cultures all specifically built hero units in order to fight myth units, while the Atlanteans could wait until they needed them and then just convert a handful of human units appropriately. In order to make Atlanteans more appealing to casual players, they dropped some of the micromanagement by allowing their villagers to gather resources without needing to build a drop-off site. Atlantean villagers could also gather at roughly 3 times the rate of other villagers, but would naturally cost more to produce. One of the benefits of working on an expansion pack was that it provided the team an opportunity to go back and tweak parts of the original game. They made a lot of improvements to the user interface, recorded games, and the scenario editor. One of the biggest changes to the user interface was the addition of the repeat build button. This would allow buildings to build an unlimited stream of units, so long as you had the resources for them. This would prove invaluable for intermediate players who wanted to improve their economies, since they could set villager production in a town centre to repeat build, and guarantee a steady stream of workers, so long as they had some food production going. Another neat user interface improvement was the strategic minimap, a larger version of the minimap that players could bring up at any time to plan their next move, or get a closer look at the entire battlefield. They also made some improvements to unit selection, such as drag selecting enemy armies to quickly see how many of them there are, as well as an easy military select option which filtered out economic and scouting units to make it easier to find your army in a crowd. The addition of a new culture presented many new game imbalances. To address this, they first started by balancing the Atlantean units against the original 3 cultures, and once they were all relatively balanced, they began making changes that affected all of them. Roughly half of the units and buildings in the original game saw some kind of adjustment. One of the biggest changes was to the Nidhogg, a Norse fire-breathing dragon that received 300 additional hit points due to it getting shot down too easily. All of the heroes in the game also had their bonuses against the animals of Set, an Egyptian god who gives you control of animals, increased. Extensive multiplayer testing and feedback from online games suggested that Set was too powerful, and his animals were part of the problem. In summer 2003, Ensemble took suggestions from its players, via fan sites, for changes to be put into the expansion. They handled this feedback in much the same way they did internally. Ideas in line with their vision of the game were considered and weighted against development constraints, resources, time, and risk. The best part about browsing these lists of ideas was that many of them mirrored what people at Ensemble had suggested. Today, Age of Mythology remains shrouded in relative obscurity. An extended edition was released in 2014, bringing with it full Steamworks integration, HD widescreen support, as well as improved visuals, and an attempt at a second expansion pack, titled Tales of the Dragon, was released in 2016 to mostly negative reviews. Sadly, neither of these were developed by Ensemble Studios, which was disbanded by Microsoft in 2009. While Age of Empires is currently seeing a revival, thanks to the release of several definitive editions of past titles, and the announcement of Age of Empires 4, Age of Mythology has yet to receive the same love and attention. Whether or not that changes in the future remains to be seen. If you enjoy this look back at the history of Age of Mythology, and would like to see more documentaries like this in the future, then be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also, if you have the means, consider throwing $1 or $2 towards my Patreon, links in the description.